to everyone joining over Zoom. Good evening to all of you who are joining me live for our final CBY summer reading, or at this point, post-summer reading of the 2024 season. It's been a really, I've enjoyed our limud together this summer, but all good things must come to an end. And I think I mentioned in the past, I'll take early recommendations on what next year's summer reading material should be. So if anyone has good suggestions, I already have some ideas myself, but we'll see what we end up going through. Now, again, we've been studying the ethics of our fighters. It's a work by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody on an English language work on Jewish military ethics. And we've gone through a lot to this point, but really some of the things at the end are, perhaps unsurprisingly, some of the most pressing, hottest, most relevant issues to what the Jewish people are currently facing in a contemporary context and in the war in which we are currently engaged. Much of the book is indeed organized chronologically, starting with pre-World War II, going through all of Israel's wars up to this point. So it's somewhat unsurprising that the most contemporary things that he discusses, and mind you, this book was written before October 7th, but some of the themes that he discusses are really, again, extraordinarily relevant to everything we are facing today. And I'd like to go through them together from a Torah standpoint, of course, as our springboard, and to talk about some of the broader issues that arise as well. Last week, we spoke about some general principles of military ethics and how they are so gravely misapplied in the context of the Jewish people. And we spoke about the important topic of civilian casualties and who bears moral responsibility for civilian casualties in the context of urban warfare. We spoke about how, from a Torah standpoint, obviously you want to avoid civilian casualties, but war is by its very nature a collective affair, highlighted by the Maharal and other sources, which again is pretty obvious to everyone in every single war, except when it comes to Israel, where somehow everyone seems to forget that and to heap condemnation upon Israel. But that's what we discussed last week. What I want to talk about this week are four really important questions as well. Again, I know we only have 45 minutes, so we'll do our best to cover each of them as thoroughly, but also as efficiently as possible. One is a question of who is a civilian. Talk about civilian casualties, combatants versus non-combatants, but who is a civilian? What is the definition of a civilian versus a combatant? Next, the question of proportionality, a word that we hear a lot about in the context of Israel's wars, and particularly in the context of critique and criticism of the state of Israel. The question of intent, a really critical question that much of the world forgets about in the context of Israel's wars. And then finally, what Rabbi Brody calls the CNN effect, the war of ideas in a world where live footage or almost live footage of the carnage of warfare is blasted onto people's screens and blasted into people's homes almost in real time, which of course has never existed, certainly to this degree, at any point in human history. Even when there was, journalism, television, etc. Now with the advent of social media and people's smartphones, in the last 10 years for sure, warfare is something that is blasted onto everyone's screens, into everyone's pockets, in a way that it never has before. So those are the four issues that I want to talk about tonight. And then we'll wrap up with some broader perspectives on the work as a whole, and certainly what the future has in store for the Jewish people. So let us begin with the question of civilians versus combatants. It is very easy to say, and it is true, that when fighting a warfare, one should target combatants and one should not target civilians. But in the context of warfare in general, and particularly in the context of contemporary urban warfare, it is not so simple to actually discover the dividing line between combatants and civilians. So Rabbi Brody actually gives a clever example of this. He says, let's say you have a scientist working on weaponry development for an enemy, let's say outside of Israel. Just again, you have two countries at war with each other, and you have a scientist who's working on developing new weaponry for one country over the other. Is that person considered a civilian or a combatant? He argues the person is a combatant. They are working on military technology for the other side. So what about the custodian who works in the same lab as that scientist and sweeps the floors? So there, the person we'd likely consider to be a civilian. Now, without the person cleaning up the lab, the scientists wouldn't be able to do their work, and without their work, they wouldn't be able to develop new weapons. So there's a ripple effect there, but we would presumably determine that the scientist is a combatant and the custodian is a civilian. He gives a similar example of a truck driver driving to a military front. You are a country, there's a country at war with you, and a truck driver is driving to the front. Now, if he's carrying rifles, munitions, artillery, etc., then he is a combatant, and you'd be totally justified in targeting the truck. If he is bringing chocolate bars to the soldiers, then it's not really as clear that that person is considered a combatant. So the line becomes quite tricky. And the truth is, there is a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban. They don't quite articulate it in the terms that we're articulating it right now, but there is a machlokas regarding what the definition of a civilian or non-combatant is. So last week we spoke extensively about the war against Shechem. Shimon and Levi wipe out the entire city of Shechem. We said that it is likely that they did something wrong. Yaakov Avinu reprimands them for what they did, and he doubles down on his reprimand at the end of his life. But at the same time, I took it as axiomatic, and I think traditional Judaism takes it as axiomatic, that whatever they did wrong, they didn't commit mass murder. Shimon and Levi were not mass murderers. So they might have done something wrong morally, they might have made some mistake, they might have made some mistakes strategically because because Yaakov Avinu says now all the other nations are going to attack us. And indeed, if you look in the Ramban, he argues that the Torah doesn't record it, that there were several subsequent wars that happened as a result of the attack against Shechem, and that the Jewish people needed to defend themselves. So it could be that was their mistake. Their mistake was not that they were mass murderers. I take it as inconceivable that two of the Shvatim were mass murderers. So what exactly was the justification for annihilating the entire city of Shechem? It's a machlokas among our mafarshim. But the approach of the Rambam is that they were effectively, again, the Rambam doesn't quite put it in these terms, but the Rambam says they were effectively combatants who were chayav misa. Shechem kidnapped Dinah. He violated Dinah. He violated the daughter of Israel. And all these people, they didn't do anything about it. They didn't go and rescue Dinah. They didn't protest. They didn't fight against their leaders and dictate, this is not what we stand for. This is not our moral code. And as a result, the Rambam says, every one of them was chayav misa. The Rambam is telling me, Rambam is effectively saying, don't tell me that they are non-combatants. They bear moral culpability for the atrocities, for the savagery, for the butchery, for the sexual violence that their leaders committed, says the Rambam. They bear responsibility as well. The Ramban, on the other hand, protests. He says that is not what the people of Shechem did wrong. The Ramban says, how do you know they had the ability to do anything about it? Shechem was the leader. He may have had all the weapons. He may have had control over the army. He may have had all the power. So how do you know that they were able to do something about it? The Ramban turns to the Rambam and says, you can't tell me that they all were bearing culpability, that they were all, again, considered part of the military effort, that they were all chayav misa. So you have this machlokas regarding the definition of civilians in general. Now, of course, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know I'm not telling you anything that you did not know, but I think it is important to reiterate, and it's important to bear moral clarity in a world that lacks it, about how much more difficult that is in the context of an urban war in which the populace is deliberately, the lines, let's say, are deliberately blurred between the populace and the combatants in so many different ways. I will say at the outset, again, some people sometimes get carried away with this argument, say there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. There are children who are 1 year old in Gaza. Like, it's hard, you really have to make a difficult moral argument to claim that children between the ages 0 and 5 are morally culpable for the atrocities of Hamas. So like we can't get carried away with these arguments. You need to be careful, again, when you say things like that, then you open yourself up to moral counterpoints, right? So what you're saying, babies are chayav misa, it's very hard to argue. But we should be very clear on the fact that this hard distinction that the media likes to draw between combatants and civilians does not exist in the context of urban warfare, and particularly the form of urban warfare that Hamas has mastered. And I say this not to their credit, it's kind of diabolical, cynical evil, but they've mastered in a way that nobody has before. Number one, Hamas fighters deliberately fight in civilian clothes. That is a war crime called perfidy. Don't expect anyone to call out Hamas for doing so. There was just a remarkably, again, I'd say it was a comic moment. It was so sad that it was comic, in which one of the former heads of Amnesty International accused Israel of the crime of perfidy when when they had soldiers dressed in civilian uniforms to do their secret hostage rescue operation, right, in order to get the hostages out. Obviously, that was a circumstance where you were doing it as a secret operation, as a rescue operation. That was the one time he remembered, there's a war crime called perfidy. You can't wear civilian clothes, and he condemned Israel for doing so. Again, it's one of those moments that's so insane that it becomes comical. But they deliberately fight in civilian clothes to blur the difference between combatants and civilians. You have the very difficult question of child soldiers. They talk about all the children that were killed in Gaza. Now, again, when you're talking about children who are 0 to 5, that's one conversation. You point out that Israel never intends, God forbid, to target babies. And again, that will get back to the intent question that we'll talk about later. But when it comes to 15-year-olds who are technically children, you run into the thorny moral question of child soldiers. This is something that's not new to this context. It's well known in other parts of the world, in parts of Africa and the like. But they'll talk about, Israel killed a child today. But it was a 15-year-old holding an RPG, and that's not a non-combatant. Rabbi Shai Shefter shared a story that he was sitting with one of the hostages at the State of the Union address. The whole story of the State of the Union is a really frustrating one. President Biden in the early days of the war gave some of the most inspiring speeches like I've ever heard. I almost cried when he said, don't, and those were great speeches. The State of the Union was a major deviation from that in a lot of ways, which we don't need to document right now. But at one point, he was talking about the toll that this war has taken on the children of Gaza. And he said that the hostage who was sitting next to him, she started crying. And he asked her why she started crying, and she said, the president is talking about the children of Gaza. She said, I was held at gunpoint with a rifle by a teenager for 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks. For an extended period of time, I was held at gunpoint by a teenager. So you talk about the children. I mean, again, they talk about the official numbers, right? Again, this is a somewhat parenthetical point, but we'll circle back to our main topic. They talk about these numbers that come from the Gaza Health Ministry. And again, of course, the Gaza Health Ministry is run by Hamas. That's always an important point to make. But the more important point to make is that they deliberately don't distinguish between combatants and civilians. You see the number 40,000 and you say, wow, that's such a high number. But they quite deliberately don't distinguish between the combatants and the civilians. And they'll release a number of quote unquote children, which again, as I'm sure many of you know, was severely modified. It was halved at a certain point. They were talking about the number of women and children who were killed. And then later they literally halved the number of women and children casualties in the war. But many of those children, and again, it's really perverse. It's sick that Hamas does this to their own children, but many of those children were combatants. Another example, again, these are all examples that happen in the context of this current war and urban warfare. What about people who are holding hostages captive? This one really got me going. The hostages in the most recent rescue, when they rescued not the most recent, the one where they rescued the four hostages, the one where Noah Argamani was rescued. They were being held in civilians' apartments. They were being held in, quote unquote, civilians were holding them captive in their living quarters, in their living space. And then again, they do this rescue operation, and immediately the Western press is talking about the number of civilian casualties. I want to know, were the people who were holding them in some side room of their living room, holding them in chains or whatever, letting them have X number of daylights, it doesn't even matter, just holding them in captivity. Were those civilians? Was that part of the civilian count of the casualties? Right? That's not a civilian anymore. You might look like a civilian. You might be holding them in your kitchen as opposed to holding them in a dungeon, but you're still holding a hostage captive. Another one that received major press was the workers at the kibbutzim, the border kibbutzim. Many of them are peacenikim, right? They're firmly from the peace camp. There were workers coming from Gaza to work in these kibbutzim, and our best estimates seem to indicate that they were feeding intelligence to Hamas. Are those civilians or are those enemy intelligence officers? I mean, I know what the answer is. I think we all know what the answer is, but that is not a civilian. And then you have the broad question of just abetting terror activity. I'm not talking about people who wave a Palestinian flag. Then by that standard, everyone who waves an Israeli flag is a combatant as well. That's not true. But what about the people who abet terror activity, who hide RPGs under their children's crib, right? Or who facilitate or help with the tunnels that are dug into the kindergarten next door? And I'm not talking about people who really object to it and just can't do anything because Hamas will shoot them in the head. The Hamas will do that. They have killed plenty of Palestinians too. I'm not talking about those people. What about the many people who support? Sure, I'll hide an RPG under my child's crib. Is that a civilian at that point? So this line that is drawn between combatants and civilians is at sometimes a tricky question, even in the context of conventional warfare. But in the context of this current war, Kal V'chomer b'menoshel Kal V'chomer, it is extraordinarily difficult. And I can tell you that even the Ramban, who argued that the people of Shechem were not chayiv misa because, you don't know, maybe they couldn't have protested against the leaders, maybe they couldn't have done anything. The Ramban would certainly agree that those who proactively and willingly and enthusiastically abetted the activities and the atrocities of their leaders, the Ramban would also agree that those were not non-combatants at that point. And again, it's an important point that we know all too well, that the world is keen on forgetting, overlooking, distorting. But if we're trying to maintain moral clarity, it is something that we need to remind ourselves. That is the question of defining civilians. The next question is the question of proportionality. It's chapter 23, what Rabbi Brody calls proportionality and the great missed opportunity. What was the great missed opportunity? Well, he really references several, but the main one that he references is an opportunity that occurred in September 2003 to, in a single strike, eliminate the entire leadership of Hamas. And Ariel Sharon, who through much of his military career was not squeamish about taking great military risks and really taking out the enemies of the Jewish people, in many instances, he heroically did so. In this instance, decided not to do so because of his experiences in Lebanon 20 years earlier. He was afraid of the international fallout that would arise because of the civilian casualties, that Israel would be accused of disproportionality, and therefore he did not make the strike. He did not order the strike. And Rabbi Brody argues that was a moral failure. Not that we're judging, but he argues that was a moral failure. The strike should have been taken. The strike should have been made. And even though there are civilian casualties, it would have been proportional when you understand what proportionality truly means, as opposed to the way that it is used by Western media. He references another incident in which on July 22nd, 2002, they took out a major terrorist, Shahada. They took out a major terrorist who was responsible for many Israeli deaths in the context of the Second Intifada. But Rabbi Brody noted that they had the opportunity to do so months earlier, in March, and they did not. And he is the one who planned the infamous Sbarro bombing, the Sbarro terror attack. That was one of the really memorable, horrific attacks of the Second Intifada. Killed Nava Applebaum right before her wedding. It was really just a horrific moment. And a lot of this rests in this term that is often used as a cudgel against the state of Israel, probably the most common cudgel used against the state of Israel, which is proportionality. It needs to be proportional. Israel's not acting proportionally. There's no proportionality. There's a quote that I love that he quotes from the philosopher Michael Walzer on page 274, where he says, I'll quote it for you. He says, unfortunately, most people don't understand the meaning of the term or its ethical implications. As Walzer noted, for most commentators, including many media figures, quote, disproportionate violence is simply violence they don't like, or it is violence committed by people they don't like. In other words, when Israel or the Jews commit violence, it's always disproportionate. That's the way they define it. So it's important to understand what proportionality is, and in understanding what it is, let's start with what it is not. Proportionality misconstrued is just a numbers game. Simple. I'll give you the moral equation of this war. Look at the number of Israelis killed and look at the number of Palestinians killed. The number of Israelis killed is between 1,000 and 2,000. The number of Palestinians killed, according to the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry, is upwards of 40,000. It's clearly not proportional. 20 times, right? Or whatever numbers you're going to take. It's much larger than the number of Palestinians killed. Israel's engaged in disproportionate force. That is the very simplistic moral argument that is waged against Israel using the term proportionality. That is not at all what the term proportionality means from a military ethics standpoint. And of course, again, when you actually look past the facile argument, you realize how absurd the argument is when you consider just more than, again, when you really just think about the issue for more than just a few seconds. What does proportionality actually mean in the context of military ethics? It means that a strike a strike's military benefit needs to outweigh its civilian cost. So to use the extreme example that he references, which is, again, an easy example to demonstrate the principle, but not really helpful in navigating real life scenarios, is you have one terrorist in a town. So you decide you're going to blow up the entire town to remove the one terrorist, right? So assuming that is not a high-ranking, leader, it's just a lackey, someone who transports grenades for Hamas, and you're going to blow up an entire town just to get this mule off the board. So it's just disproportional. The amount of side damage that you're causing is greater than the military advantage. Now, what about taking out somebody like Yahya Sinwar? Let's say that one person is not a mule who's just transporting grenades, but is the mastermind behind October 7th, is the official, and he's already been for a long time, the unofficial leader of Hamas, the person who is their symbol of resistance and hope, the person whom, if he's killed, then effectively the war's done. I mean, in many ways, of course, again, Hamas will always try to rearm, and they'll try to look. There's always going to be insurgency, but what if that's the person that we're talking about? Then proportionality is a very one-to-one correspondence there. What is the correspondence? As Rabbi Brody points out, to come up with what he calls a proportionality meter. There's no meter that gives you an exact metric for how much it is. Again, he quotes comically that they brought a group of ethicists together to come up with how many civilians is it worth per combatant. And what was the number they came up with? He writes 3.14 pi. Excellent. Okay, shkaya. So it's the same as the measure of the circumference of a circle compared to its diameter. That's a remarkable miracle of mathematics that happened that way. But he says you can't come up with a number. And how do you assess the value of somebody like Sinwar or Mohammed Deif, right? Who, again, Israel was criticized for the civilian casualties when they took out Mohammed Deif, who was, again, one of the major symbols of resistance and important military leaders of Hamas. How do you construct that proportionality? That is what true proportionality means. When you are dealing with a terror organization that slaughtered 1,400 people in a single day and vows to do it again and again and again, you don't just count numbers. That's not what it's about. It's about making sure that the people of Israel are able to live with a basic sense of safety and security. And again, if you just annihilate all of Gaza City to take one terrorist out, then that would be a fair claim of disproportionality. But when you are taking out terrorists who deliberately embed themselves within civilian infrastructure, as we were discussing a moment ago, in this line between civilians and combatants, then proportionality is not about numbers. It's not about these facile number comparisons. From a Torah standpoint, we saw the two Maharals from last week. On the one hand, in the context of Shechem, the Maharal says that warfare is collective by its very nature. It's two nations going to war against each other, and that's part of the nature of warfare. That is what war is. On the flip side, he says that Yaakov Avinu, when going to war against Esav, was afraid lest he kill someone who didn't really want to go to war, was only coerced to by Esav because he thought Esav was going to kill him, and Yaakov Avinu was afraid that he would take out that person as well. So, as we said, the tension between the Maharals is, obviously, from a Torah standpoint, when we can, we're not looking to create collateral damage that kills people who are non-combatants. But there's also a recognition that such is the nature of warfare, and all the more so, kal v'chomer b'menosh kal v'chomer, when that is the strategy. When the strategy is on part of in a terror organization like Hamas, to maximize civilian casualties on their side as part of their diplomatic warfare against Israel, then that is part of war. And the true notion of proportionality, that again, we should limit civilian casualties when we can, but when the military target is so significant that it can't be avoided, it is indeed necessary, is clearly something that the Torah licenses and allows. It's almost it's again the facile arguments, just number comparisons, are almost absurd when you give them any serious consideration. Now, I will say, give me 1 second. I will say, and that we're going to return to this a little bit later, where the numbers play out really well. This whole comparison of numbers and making a chart, 40,000 versus 2,000, where it plays out really well? Social media. If the area of the arena of intellectual debate is a shallow intellectual environment, which in the 21st century it is, then we face a very significant disadvantage. And that is part of the disadvantage that Israel continues to face. It's very easy to say 40,000 versus, a much smaller number. It's very easy to say hashtag apartheid, hashtag free Palestine, all eyes on Rafah, right? putting up in the debate of ideas, I believe you'll be unsurprised to think we very much have the upper hand, very much have the upper hand. But in the debate of hashtags, I think we are at a significant disadvantage in the realm of hashtags. And unfortunately, much of contemporary debate transpires not in the realm of truth, but in the realm of hashtags and social media. So it's why the term proportionality is thrown around the way it is, not even just on social media, in traditional media as well. It's important for us to understand what it means and what it does not mean. But again, we'll circle back to this a little bit later. In the arena of intellectual debate, if we can call it intellectual, which everything needs to be expressed in like 42 characters or less, it becomes more difficult to explain what proportionality actually is and how it applies to Israel's wars. Yeah.
I wanted to ask in terms of putting Israeli soldiers' lives in danger.
Yeah.
From a halachic, I'm not talking about all the other things.
Yeah. So we are going to get back to that in a little bit. Where are we going to get back to that?
Not sure where.
Yeah, we're gonna get back to that soon. Okay, we're gonna circle back to that. It is something that Rabbi Brody discusses as well, and he happens to discuss it in the very next chapter. So let's jump into chapter 24, which is the question of intent.
Rabbi,
yeah.
In terms of culpability of civilians, they voted Hamas.
Right.
So that has some kind of impact on how
so
we do things. And why is it also with Amaya? Mention say every single baby, man, woman,
right,
everything.
right. So Ruby poses two important questions. The first is, what about the fact they voted for Hamas? So I think that does weigh into this calculus to some degree. Yeah, again, you have to figure out how, because I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what the counter argument is and what my counter argument would be to the counter argument. Counter argument would be then any voter who voted for an Israeli, party would be considered a combatant as well, right? That would be the counter argument. Now, I think we would say there's a massive difference between voting for just a government party and voting for a terrorist party, right? Exactly. In other words, that there is a major difference between the two, and that would be our counter argument as well. But you do have to bear in mind that even though Hamas won a majority, it was not everyone that voted for them, right? I don't remember what the percentage was. And bear in mind, this election happened when? In 2006. So it happened 18 years ago. So, look, I think it does weigh into the moral calculus for sure. How exactly to figure out how it plays into the moral calculus is, I think, a tricky question. Also, like knowing who did and who did not is like, is a little more difficult. It's much clearer when you're dealing with a population that just openly abets Hamas by hiding RPGs under a child's crib or something like that. The second question was about Amalek. So we did address Amalek earlier. Amalek is a challenging case because it seems to defy many general military ethics that exist outside the context of Amalek. So we did speak about that earlier. We spoke about 3 different approaches to the mitzvah of Amalek. Our assumption is, the assumption of most poskim, certainly within the halachic mainstream, is that the imperative of Amalek to wipe out every man, woman, and child was limited to that case and would not apply to other cases. Now, I will say that many do believe that defensive wars have elements of Amalek. In other words, that those who embrace the ideology of Amalek, fighting against them is in that category of Milchemes Mitzvah. But I don't know of any, mainstream poskim who would maintain that category of total annihilation applies to contemporary wars. And quite obviously, you need to be very careful with those ideas because, that could lead to extreme ramifications that would defy some of the broader ethics. I mean, like, for example, I'll just give you one example that applies even to the context of Amalek. The Rambam says that you have to offer peace terms to Amalek. That's the sheet of the Rambam in the 5th paragraph of Malachim. It's if they refuse, then you annihilate men, women, and children. So applying that category is tricky. Again, it is something that we addressed a little bit earlier, but it's certainly an important question in the context of wars of self-defense against those who adopt the ideology of Amalek, seeking to annihilate the Jewish people. Okay, what about the question of intent? So this really goes directly back to the numbers game. 1,200 civilians killed on October 7th, 40,000 Palestinians killed since then. So again, and let's even adopt the again, if we're for a moment adopting the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry's numbers. And way more civilians killed in Gaza than the 1,200 civilians killed in October 7th. So the moral calculus is clear. Palestinians are right, Hamas is noble, and Israel is the evil aggressor, right? That's the simple calculus that is adopted. Now, again, there are so many flaws with that calculus. We started discussing some of them before, but another major problem with the calculus is that it ignores the important question of intent. Intent may seem like a trivial matter. Who really cares? You know, at the end of the day, the numbers are the numbers, but it's actually quite critical in the context of military ethics. Just to invoke some of Rabbi Brody's examples, he talked about it. He gave a particular example from a NATO strike that happened in Yugoslavia. He says, consider two examples. One where NATO is targeting a military cell, and they didn't realize that there was a group of refugees staying nearby. And in the context of targeting the military cell, refugees are killed. Scenario number one. Scenario number two, NATO is deliberately targeting a group of refugees because they're doing it in cold blood, because it's a terror tactic, et cetera, and they happen to get lucky and take out an enemy militant cell that happens to be located nearby. And let's say the number of casualties are identical in scenario A and scenario B. Would we assess them ethically the same way? Of course we wouldn't assess them ethically the same way. In scenario A, you're targeting a genuine military target, and by some, tragic accident, you didn't realize there were refugees nearby, and they ended up perishing in the strike. In scenario B, you're deliberately targeting civilians. You happen to get lucky, and you got military individuals as well. But of course, it's a very far cry. They're just dramatically different in terms of our ethical assessment of the two of them. Another example that he gives is, let's say there's a hospital with a neonatal unit, with a maternity ward, right next to a weapons and ammunitions factory. So again, same exact example. Scenario A, you target the munitions factory, it sets off a chain reaction, and the hospital is damaged as well. Scenario number two, you deliberately target the maternity ward, and there's a chain reaction that damages the munitions factory. And the damage and number of casualties, number of fatalities is identical in both cases. Would we say that those are the same ethically? Of course, we would not say that those are the same ethically. If you're targeting a munitions factory and there's a fire that spreads to the hospital, again, that's a tragic side effect, but it's not something that is in any way the same as deliberately targeting the hospital and getting lucky with the factory. And the concept of intent is very important in halacha. In halacha, we have a concept called kavana. Kavana has ramifications in a whole host of different areas in the context of mitzvos and in the context of aveira as well. Rabbi Brody references the halacha categories of davar she'eino miskavein and psik reisha. Davar she'eino miskavein is when you do something that is mutter, and as a result, something usher transpires. So to use a classic example, in halacha, you're dragging a bench on Shabbos outdoors, and it happens to dig a furrow in the ground. Digging a furrow in the ground on Shabbos is prohibited under the malach of choresh. It's plowing. Moving a bench is not prohibited. You can move a bench. So I don't want to plow. I don't want to dig a furrow or a hole in the ground. I just wanted to move the bench. That's all I wanted to do. But this resulted without my intent. It's a davar she'eino miskaven. So davar she'eino mitkaven. Okay. Rabbi Brody does point out there's a category called psik reisha. Let's say I know that it is going to happen. I know that when I open the refrigerator door, the light is going to turn on inside the refrigerator, which according to Rav Moshe is a psik reisha. There's actually a little bit of machlokas in the poskim as to whether that's psik reisha, but we leave that aside. We'll use that as an example nonetheless. I know that it's going to happen, but it's not really my primary intent. The halakha distinguishes between psik reisha de nichale and psik reisha de lo nichale. Right? When I open the refrigerator, it's good for me that the light goes on. I desire that result. Even if it's not my primary intent, I benefit from that result. Contrast that with a case where I walk into a door and some security light on the camera turns on, which again, I don't care about. It doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't give me any advantage. It's a psik reisha de lo ichbas lei, or scenarios where there's psik reisha de lo nichale, where the side effect is actually bad for me. It damages me. I don't want the side effect to go on. In our again, I'm trying to think offhand of an example of psikration. There are certainly many in the halacha. But let's say you're dragging, to use one example, potentially, again, all of these deserve more attention and qualification if this were Shir Nechel Shabbos. But let's say the bench is now very, very heavy, very heavy. I know that by dragging it, I'm going to dig a furrow in the earth, but I don't want that. I don't want this furrow across my front lawn. It's not good for me. I know it's going to happen, but I need to move the bench. So what can I do? That's called a psik resha to lo nichale, right? When Israel strikes a terrorist, it never ever wants, a child in a nearby household to perish in the strike. Sometimes, as we said in the context of proportionality, that ends up happening. But the question of kavana is a very, very important question in halacha. And that question of intent is critical in military ethics as well. It's often overlooked and ignored. But when you have a terror organization, and again, people don't like using the word terror. There was a whole controversy. The BBC wouldn't use the word terror in the context of Hamas. Any meaningful definition of the term, decide what it is. Any meaningful definition of the term, Hamas qualifies. So again, like you could choose your definition, but when people say, "Oh, Hamas isn't a terrorist organization," my response is, "So just define terror for me, please. Just define it, because any meaningful definition they qualify. They deliberately target civilians, women, children. They engage in horrific atrocities. They engage in psychological warfare. There's no meaningful definition for which they don't qualify. So you can't compare a terror organization that deliberately seeks to brutalize and savagely brutalize men, women, and children to an organization that is seeking, the IDF, that is seeking to defend its people from those monsters, and tragically is placed in situations when there is collateral damage, and would much rather have a battle against a force in uniform on an open battlefield than fighting in the labyrinth of the urban warfare setting with lots of civilian casualties. But that's the position they're placed in, and intent is critical in that regard. Now, before we go into the public image and the CNN issue, he does address the question of what he calls double effect, the question of whether soldiers need to risk their lives in order to minimize civilian casualties. He quotes Michael Walter, who says, in the context of Israel, he said, soldiers are obligated morally to risk their lives in order to minimize civilian casualties. And predictably, Rabbi Brody very passionately criticizes that view, that soldiers need to, proactively risk their lives in order to minimize civilian casualties. From a general standpoint, from the standpoint of the authorities, right? The goal is always to minimize casualties as much as possible. That's why you have this oversight where strikes need to be licensed, the proportionality needs to be there, etc. But to tell a soldier in combat that he needs to proactively risk his life in order to limit civilian casualties or to risk the life of his comrades, Brody finds preposterous. And I think this is an area, and we'll see another one of this in a moment, where you have this wide divide between, we'll see not an exact example of this, but a similar example of this in a moment, where you have this wide divide between philosophers who sit in a classroom and actual military personnel who have actually been in a battlefield. It's easy for a philosopher in his ivory tower to say, yeah, risk your life in order to limit the collateral damage. But when you speak to actual military personnel, it seems almost absurd to do that. And what Rabbi Brody notes that these philosophers forget is what he calls, he has a pithy formulation for it. He calls it the brother over other formulation. In the context of warfare, we don't treat every single life as the same. Now, that's a tragic thing to say. Obviously, in times of peace, we believe every human being is created b'tselem Elokim, is created in the divine image. Every human being is a world unto themselves and possesses immense sanctity. In the context of warfare, your primary moral imperative is to defend your comrades, your colleagues, is to defend your people back home. That is your primary moral imperative. And to say that you should risk the life of your brother in arms in order to limit collateral damage is something that, again, a philosopher has the luxury of saying, but if you speak to actual military personnel, the notion is radical. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Why would we even play a thought if we have pikuach nefesh? Why would we even think it?
Well, here you're taking lives. Pikuach nefesh. Again, if I'm playing the devil's advocate here, right? So again, but we know that you're not, again, outside of a war context, you're not allowed to take someone else's life sorry, for everybody on Zoom, the question was, what about pikuach nefesh? So why would I have to risk my life? So but we know that in halacha, you're not allowed, one of the scenarios where you cannot save your life by taking someone else's life. Now, I want to be very clear that I understand. But my point is that if you're applying the category pikuach nefesh, it's clearly different in this context than it does exist ordinarily. So, I mean, I agree with your conclusion. Don't get me wrong. I think you're correct. But I'm not sure that would be the category I would couch it in. Let's talk about two final issues. One is the question of public image and the CNN effect. So as we said before, the reality of warfare has changed very dramatically. I'd say probably post World War II, and it continues to change even more as technology continues to advance. And one of the ways in which it has changed dramatically is in terms of the visibility of warfare. Traditionally, you had the battlefront, where the horrors of war were quite visible, and you had the home front, where it was sanitized to some degree, and you weren't watching live feeds of the trenches in World War I or the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. But nowadays, there's almost immediate access to the full exposure of the horrors of war. War is a horrific, horrible, horrible thing. And there's unfiltered exposure to the horrors of war that is being broadcasted almost in real time across the world that everyone has access to. And in some ways, that changes warfare. Now, does it change the ethics of warfare? Not directly. In other words, the only difference is not that war is more horrific. Perhaps in some ways it is, and perhaps in some ways it's less horrific. But what changes is just the exposure to it. And therefore, you have lots of people who just have this visceral emotional reaction to the scenery of warfare, and they jump to the conclusion that this is immoral because they are rightly repulsed by the horrors of warfare, but aren't going through the actual ethical conundrum to consider whether warfare is ethical or not. If I said before that there's sometimes a gap between philosophers and actual military personalities, I say there's also often a gap between journalists and social media personalities on the one hand versus actual military experts. People who don't have any training in warfare, tactics, strategy, certainly not ethics. They just see the carnage and they say, this is horrible. And whoever's doing it must be immoral because it is so horrible. As opposed to saying, this is horrible. War is horrible. It's a horrible thing. We would live in a much better world if it was never, ever needed or necessary. But given that war is necessary, this is the nature of it, and it does not make those who are engaged in it inherently immoral because they are engaged in it. He quotes in this in his book, Air Force Colonel W. Hayes Park. I have never heard of him before reading the book, but apparently he's a great expert or one of the foremost experts in aerial ethics, the ethics of aerial warfare, who has praised Israel for its conduct. I think many have probably heard of John Spencer, who's one of the leading military historians and ethicists at West Point, who has extensively praised Israel in the context of this current war. Quote, Israel sets the gold standard in terms of preserving civilian lives, end quote. So you have these military experts who see what's happening, and they can kind of separate the inherent horrors of the carnage of war from the ethical questions of whether this particular war is indeed being prosecuted righteously versus others who just, again, have a visceral reaction to the horrors of war, which is correct. Again, war is indeed horrible, but can't separate that from the question of ethical culpability. What does it mean? It means several things. It means, A, that we have to fight on that front, too. I think Israel was very slow to the party in realizing that contemporary wars are fought in the realm of ideas, not just on the battlefield, that they are fought in the streams of social media and not just in the streets of Rafah. Israel was very slow to the party on that. And for a while, that was a major frustration of American Jews. Like, why can't you guys just get someone on English television who's capable of making a cogent argument in favor of Israel in fluent English? I think Israel has caught up significantly. I think they've done a much better job in the context of this current war than they've ever done before. Figures like Elon Levy, who did a really good job. There were some viral clips of him dealing with some of these absurd questions from the heavily biased media. We had Jonathan Conricus here, who I think has done a very good job, and many, many others. I don't want to say too much, but there's a Chayelet who is in charge of Israel's English language social media, who speaks to a lot of American groups, who's been doing great work. So I will say the Hasbara has been much better. You saw it, I think, most dramatically, after the Al-Aqti hospital bombing, which of course everybody immediately blamed on Israel. Israel was quick in getting out their narrative. They correctly and responsibly said we have to do an investigation, but they recognized this is not an investigation that has the luxury of resting for 24 hours or 48 hours or 12 hours for that matter. They really and expeditiously got out the facts. And of course, there's someone who will always blame Israel no matter what, but they did really, again, the fact that the U.S. government came out and said this wasn't Israel, I was shocked. I've never seen anything like that before. They really did a much better job than they have in the past. So, yeah, of course, again, like that's not a shkoyach, shkoyach. But again, there will always be the people who just who engage in the blood libels, irrespective of the fact. But I will say that Israel has been fighting on that front. We also have to accept that there will be some who never accept. Again, going back to that point exactly, there will be some who never accept the truth and aren't interested in it, and we need to be aware of that as well. And that's part of the reality too, the sad reality, but that is part of the reality as well. Now that kind of transitions into my final point, but before that, questions. Carl, you had something.
I think to mention that General Eisenhower fighting the war today compared to what it was then.
Yeah.
You had to do what you had to do, and then you saw it a week later.
It's a totally different kind of warfare. Carl points out that you can't imagine a General Eisenhower fighting wars today. Yeah, 100%. I hear, or or a General Grant, or it's different. It adds a totally different dimension to warfare that didn't exist even just a few decades ago. It didn't exist. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Good job on Hasbara for the first couple of months, but they no longer have access to the big networks.
Oh.
He's invited them anymore.
Yeah. The point. Right. No. The point was that. Yeah. So the when I said that they did a good job of Hasbara, I want to be very clear. It was clear to me, it was evident to me that like the sympathy that existed for Israel was not going to last. That Shabbos, I said that enjoy it while it lasts, people, because it's not lasting for very long. It was not, again, to use a paradigm that I've spoken about in other contexts. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And I think the way they dealt with it, held things off, cogently made the case for the few fair-minded people in the world. I think that they did as well as they could. I thought they did as well as they could. Yeah.
I don't know if you spoke about it already, but I wanted to know about the humanitarian aid that we have to give and what it's doing to save help
Hamas
and hurting our hostages.
Yeah. That's a really good question. We didn't address that question. Mindy asks, what about humanitarian aid? If you know that humanitarian aid is not just going to the innocent 5-year-olds, but is being hoarded by Hamas and is funding their military effort, is it ethical to give humanitarian aid? I think that's a really profound question. And again, like when else? I was, without getting into too many details here, I was at a meeting with Representative Andy Kim, who's likely going to be our next senator. It was a group of rabbis with Andy Kim expressing our feelings, thoughts, concerns. So I was given the talking points on anti-Semitism. So we spoke about anti-Semitism, and another rabbi in the group, not an Orthodox rabbi, was speaking about Israel. And if you know Kim, again, he happens to be a wonkish guy. Like he has a military background. In other words, being involved in military in various ways. But this rabbi came out pretty aggressively, saying like, when else is a country morally obligated to provide the supply lines for its enemy to fight against it? Was the question that he was posing. I can't say I have any sources offhand to bear on that question, but it's a troubling one.
Goes back to CNN.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
that's why we're doing it.
That's again, he doesn't address that in the book, Mindy, and I can't say I offhand have any sources to bear that directly speak to that, but I can tell you that it's something that is worth addressing. Okay, my final point here is on Kiddush v'chilul Hashem, and this comes up at the very end of the book. What is Kiddush v'chilul Hashem in the context of this CNN effect that we've been describing? So on the one hand, we often think of Kiddush v'chilul Hashem in the context of external perception. How do people perceive us? How do people perceive Jews? When we act in a positive way, outsiders look at us, and they praise Hashem. When we act in an inappropriate way, people look at us and they curse Hashem. That's often the framework through which, on an individual level, I'm not talking on a national level, on an individual level, that's often how we talk about Kiddush v'chilul Hashem. And that's not incorrect. It has its basis in a Gemara Masechus Yoma, where Yoma Daf Pevav tells us that that is indeed the definition of Kiddush Hashem. You conduct yourself in a way that others praise Hashem. Ashrei Aviv Shalim Do Torah, Ashrei Rabbi Shalim Do Torah. Praiseworthy are those who taught him Torah. The Torah is so wonderful, it's beautiful. That's Kiddush Hashem. Aviv Shalim Do Torah, Rabbi Shalim Do Torah. And people curse Torah because of your conduct. That's Chilul Hashem. So there is legitimacy to that. But that's not the only form of Kiddush v'chilul Hashem. And certainly when we move beyond the individual level to a national level, that paradigm needs to shift in several ways. First of all, it needs to shift because what's praiseworthy in the eyes of the nations, we know, as we've been discussing all along, is not something that is even accessible to us. If what's praiseworthy to the nations is that the Jews should lay down and die, I don't think anyone would argue that that is what constitutes Kiddush Hashem. And defending Jewish lives is a Chilul Hashem, because that's not what the UN Human Rights Council desires. That's not what they want. Quite obviously, that's not Kiddush v'chilul Hashem. And number two, as I said before, that's not the only form of Kiddush v'chilul Hashem. There are other forms of Kiddush v'chilul Hashem as well. And there are two that Brody highlights that I want to kind of lean into here. The first, he points out, is the mere political ascendance, defense capabilities, existence of the state of Israel, according to many, certainly according to us in this room, and the Gedolei Torah and the Torah pole stars that we look to for guidance in our Hashkafas HaChaim, in our approach to life, they view that in and of itself as a Kiddush Hashem. Soloveitchik viewed the foundation of the state of Israel as a Kiddush Hashem. After thousands of years, when Jewish blood was cheap and the Jewish people were trampled upon, Jewish pride has been restored, Jewish sovereignty has been restored, Jewish deterrence and self-defense has been restored. The fact that Jewish blood is no longer cheap is in and of itself a form of Kiddush Hashem. That's number one. And number two, moral behavior is a form of Kiddush Hashem. Not in the external perception form where, they perceive us and they tell us this is good, this is bad, but true, genuine moral behavior. When, under difficult circumstances, we can still say we are going to maintain our fealty to the Torah, its moral principles, its timeless guidance. We are going to remain faithful and loyal to it, despite come what may. That is a form of Kiddush v'chilul Hashem as well. He argues in the book that if you think about these two forms of Kiddush v'chilul Hashem, the first, political ascendance, the Kiddush Hashem through Jewish self-defense, is often associated with the thought of like Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, and Kiddush Hashem through moral behavior is often associated with the school of Rabbi Yehuda Amital, two Zionist leaders who were, again, originally very much aligned, and then later had very dramatic disagreements in terms of their interpretation of religious Zionism, or in terms of religious tzionut. But he points out that ultimately both agree to both principles. That again, it's not an either or. There is Kiddush Hashem through Jewish self-defense, through Tzahal, through the existence of the state of Israel, through Jewish sovereignty, and there's Kiddush Hashem when we maintain our fealty and loyalty to the timeless moral standards of the Torah. And accordingly, I guess as a concluding note to this entire series, in so many ways, the Jewish military ethics that we have been discussing are in so many ways the ultimate Kiddush Hashem, because it entails both. When Tzahal get up and on October 8th declare that this pogrom will not go unpunished, and the perpetrators will not be able to just scurry away and celebrate their victory. And Jewish blood is not cheap, and we are going to defend, and we are going to deter, and we are going to make sure that they're never capable of doing this again. And we are going to do so in a way that accords with the timeless ethics of Torah, not, again, all the biased, fake military ethics that are thrown at Israel just as an artificial cudgel to just try to get them not to defend themselves in order to make the state of Israel go away permanently. But real ethics, i.e. ethics with a capital E, ethics from the Torah, the timeless ethics that bind our people. When we say we are going to do it, we are going to defend, we are going to proudly stand for our sovereignty, and we're going to proudly defend our people, and we're going to do so in a way that's in accordance with the timeless principles of Torah Hashem, the timeless ethical principles that have always guided and will always guide the Jewish people. So many ways, that is the ultimate Kiddush Hashem. the ultimate Kiddush Hashem by combining these two forms of national Kiddush Hashem. Kiddush Hashem that occurs through the sovereignty, deterrence, defense of the state of Israel, and the Kiddush Hashem that occurs through our fealty to the timeless principles of Torah. As we head into a new year, we ask Hashem that in honor of this ultimate Kiddush Hashem that has been made over the course of this past year, please God, may that ultimate Kiddush Hashem no longer be necessary. May Hashem be Mekadesh Shemo by giving us ultimate victory over our enemies, a true Kiddush Shem Shemayim. And may this be a year in which we are able to be Mekadesh Shemayim without the losses, the casualties, the pain and difficulty that have characterized us that have characterized this past year. May this be a year of bracha, of Yeshua, of Geula for us and for all of Am Yisrael. One second. Everybody on Zoom, I thank you for joining us. I wish everybody a good evening.